I was interested in looking at spaces, public eating places, like the Kopitiam, which is an ethnic Chinese coffee shop, very, very much unique to the landscape in Malaysia and Singapore. And I started reading on coffee houses. There's a big literature on coffee houses in Europe, as what's known as third places. And this is a term from Ray Oldenburg, a sociologist in the US, who was writing about the effects of urbanization and the growth of suburbs in the US. And he was saying that as a result of this, and as a result of car culture, these third places are starting to shrink, or you don't have as many of these third places. And what these third places are, is they are basically places for people to hang out. Okay, they're third places because the first place is your home and your second place is your workplace, and people need a third place to hang out that is not the home and that is not the workplace. So he gives us as examples your community centers, your neighborhood bar, even a corner grocery shop where everybody, where there's some stability and people are there in the neighborhood who observe the comings and goings and are familiar with the customers who come and go. And sometimes your kids could just run down there and get a carton of milk, and the owner would know the kid, would be familiar with the kid. But he says, with the growth of these suburbs, your kid would have to be old enough to get into the car and drive to the nearest grocery store. And this sort of suburbanization really gets in the way of community building, because these third places are very important for building a sense of place and community, and for people to come together and hang out and belong and talk about politics, talk about their relationships, as a kind of civic space, right? So for me, the coffee shop, the Kopitiam in Malaysia and Singapore did that, or the traditional ones did that, and they did that because they were affordable. So they have to be accessible and affordable. So you have this has been written out about, a journalist says it's a kind of place where even where the very rich man who drives out in the Mercedes will come and buy to eat, and then you have the trishaw puller just at the next table, right? So different classes, and increasingly now different genders will go. But in the past it was mostly men or old men who had time on their hands who would hang out at the coffee shop to gossip, to talk about the news of the day, etc. So that was what I was interested in, and regardless of race as well. I think so the people who talk about nostalgia, who write about nostalgia is an interesting thing, because nostalgia comes from the term of being homesick, of missing something. I think that the people who experience nostalgia in the beginning were soldiers fighting, who were away from home. But the problem with nostalgia is that we tend to look back and we forget about the present. But really, other theorists who talk about nostalgia say that there's something about the present that is missing, that is making us look back with fondness and optimism, with a kind of rosy lenses about the past. Of course, the past was also not that great. So in the case of Malaysia and Singapore, because we have Islamization in the last 30 years, a kind of resurgent and more literal or scriptural interpretation of Islam, following probably a kind of Saudi-driven interpretation of Islam, then there's a sense of division, because it creates a sense of otherness, that if you are not Muslim, then you're not one of us. And there are lots of things in place, processes in place, that is then carried out through policy making, and that also becomes socialization and stigma, that prevent people of different religious backgrounds and ethnicities in Malaysia to come and sit together and eat together, right? So you have with the Islamization, or shall we call it Arabization, you also have halalization. The Malaysian government is very big in promoting halalization. So halal means permissible by Islam, and it also means not just no alcohol, no pork, but the processes have to be very very clear, right, about what is permissible and what isn't. So in terms of cooking, to get a halal certificate, you have to make sure that there are Muslims who are in the kitchen who supposedly know what they're doing. And it's also very much about cleanliness and ritual cleansing and things like that. So because Muslims in Malaysia are now increasingly worried about halal, how to be a good Muslim, then there's this idea that they have to only go and eat in halal places. Not everyone is like that, but there's such a strong pressure that if you go to eat in a kopitiam with your Chinese friends, and they might be eating pork, and even if you're not, you might feel that someone is going to look at you and say what you're doing is not right, and that as a Muslim you shouldn't be doing this. So that's the problem. So to go back to your question about nostalgia, there's a nostalgia on the part of filmmakers, people who grew up at a time where they remember a past, whether it's their own past or maybe their parents' past, where Malaysians could sit together without this concern, and so they're trying to recreate this through through films where they represent coffee shops or kopitiam, or through increasingly the mamak stall or the Tamil Muslim eatery, which is of course halal. We see that nostalgia is also driven in the marketing of the gentrified or yuppified coffee shops. So these are franchised coffee shops like Old Town, Kopitiam, a lot of them. So in Singapore there's Kilini and Yakun Kaya, and they have now branched out, expanded to Malaysia, to the Philippines, even maybe Australia. Right, so what they're doing is selling you nostalgia for a past. It's a past which is uncomplicated by speed and urbanization, by rapid modernization, and the sense that we have to live in a rush, hyper modern, hyper sped up society. So I think it's important we recognize that what are the reasons what are the factors that are happening today that are making people look back with some nostalgia, and to also recognize that nostalgia is very much part of a marketing strategy that taps into our unhappiness with our present conditions. So when I went to do research in coffee shops, really I was motivated by one factor, which is how to bring Muslims and non-Muslims in Malaysia and Singapore to come and eat together, right? Because you have this sense that to be a good Muslim, I have to go and eat in halal places. And cosmopolitanism is a kind of theory that came out in the 90s, and basically the philosophers who came up with this, they were talking about globalization, and the globalization making it increasingly difficult for people to think within the national geographical borders, right? So people who are cosmopolitan feel that they are citizen of the world, that they can identify with people of different national backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds. So you have organizations that are cosmopolitan or global, if you like, organizations like Maisons Sans Frontières, or Journalists Without Boundaries, or even your Red Crescent or Red Cross, right? The way you do aid work in different countries, and people will donate money to help someone else that is not of the same nationality or ethnicity or of the same religion, or maybe they are of the same religion but not of the same country. So I'm using cosmopolitanism to describe people who are open to the concept of otherness and difference, who accept someone else of a different ethnic background or religious background or class background or sexuality compared to theirs, right? At the same time, they are also critical of their own background or of their own ethnic privilege or their class. They are aware of what their problems are, and as much as they are open to other people's identities, they are also aware or critically aware of what those problems might be. But the cosmopolitan person would be one that is open to crossing those boundaries. And I use cosmopolitanism from David, I can't remember his name right now, it'll come. He was writing about multiculturalism in the US, and he's saying that instead of having pluralism, which is kind of what we have in Malaysia, where each ethnic group will grow up side by side with other ethnic groups, but really they are still in their own ethnic groups, right? They don't really cross those boundaries very much. And so cosmopolitanism breaks down those boundaries and allows people to cross those boundaries more easily. So when I say cosmopolitanism and when I describe these third places as cosmopolitan, it's exactly that idea that these spaces allow for people to mingle across ethnic boundaries. You don't forget your ethnic boundaries, but you don't let it impede you from mixing with other people. So that's what cosmopolitanism is, or at least that's how I'm using it. Yes, so when I was doing research on kopitiams, because they are run by Chinese, and because of increasing Islamization, then there's a kind of distrust of the the Chinese-run coffee shop on the part of conservative Muslims. So people would say, well, if you're looking for a cosmopolitan place, a place that allows for Muslims and non-Muslims to eat together comfortably, you should look at the mama. Mama is actually a term which in Tamil means maternal uncle, right? So it's a familial term, but in Malaysia it has become an ethnic term. It means Indian Muslim, but more specifically it means Tamil Muslim. So these are eateries that sell rice dishes with curries, or nasi kandar. It would sell maybe fried noodles, and it's run by Muslims. So there would be no pork, and it would be halal by virtue of the fact that the people who run the place, who cook the dishes, are themselves Muslims. Yeah. So yeah, indeed. So these are the places that Malaysians of various ethnic backgrounds would go and eat together. When people say mama, they are not that specific. Okay, they don't realize that it doesn't refer to Indian Muslims from various parts of India, right? It's actually a Tamil word. So the mama, depending on the tone that you use, can be a friendly place, can be a tone that can just mean the person who runs the store that I'm familiar with, but the category itself is a problematic one, and the term itself is a problematic one, depending on how people use it. So, for example, Tamil Muslims look like they're Indian, So because they look Indian, because in Malaysia the majority of the Indian population are Tamils, Hindus who had been brought during the British colonial times to work in the plantations, to work along the railroads, things like that. Most of them are Hindu. So there's a kind of stereotyping in Malaysia where you stereotype ethnic people, and you think if you're Indian you have to be Hindu, and if you're Chinese you are Taoist or Buddhist. Of course there are also Christians, spanning both Chinese and Hindus, Chinese and Indians, and everybody else except Malays. So when people see the mama, they think they're Indian, so they can't possibly be Muslim. Because when people think Muslim, they think Malay, who are the majority, and the Malays are constitutionally defined as Muslims, right? Constitutionally. And so the Tamil Muslim straddles this kind of ambiguous position where they are the host of a place that brings everyone together, but when times are difficult, when you start to stereotype and put people in boxes because they don't fit into a neat box, and that box which includes their ethnicity and their I wouldn't say race, but their religion and their ethnic background, then they become a problem. So you have for example, quite many years ago already, in the mid 2000s, the Islamic authorities raided a Tamil Muslim nasi kandar rice curry place, because and tried to make them take down these pictures of the Kaaba and the Islamic Arabic words, saying that they could not possibly be Muslims, and where was their halal certificate. But because they are already Muslims, they didn't need a halal certificate. So here you can see this sort of violation of their human rights in a way, just because they don't fit very nicely into this sort of racial category. There's a distrust on the part of the Islamic authorities, who are mostly Malay, who want to uphold Malay hegemony and who see Islam as part of that Malay hegemony, and who are unable to divorce or to see the diversity or the kind of array of Islam. Okay, so there's a very narrow interpretation of what Islam is in this country, and they also see Islam as belonging to Malays alone for some reason, and see Islam as buttressing Malay hegemony. So when you have people who don't quite fit in, then you have a problem for these people according to their definition. Yeah. The other issue with the mama is that they also become scapegoats. Okay, so some of them have joined UMNO. So over the years, through maybe 1 or 2 generations or longer, you have Tamil Muslims, particularly in Penang, who've joined UMNO. Right, so when the opposition, people who are opposition supporters, who get upset when these people come out and protest the opposition government in Penang, and these people are UMNO supporters, they are UMNO members, then there'll be a call out to boycott mama places. But really, not all mama eateries are run by UMNO supporters, actually, So again, you cannot go into these places and eat the food and then at the same time insult and stereotype the people who run these places without really knowing them. You kind of have to know them. Right? So I think the book is trying to say, as Malaysians, we've adopted all this food, and they've become national foods. And the reason they become national foods is because they're very hybrid, they're very mixed. You have Tamil Muslims making noodle dishes. You don't get noodles in India, you get noodles from China, and it's only because they've come here, and the sort of confluence of Chinese influences, Indian influences, Malay influences, Thai influences, that you get some of the dishes that we have today. And these dishes, we as Malaysians have taken them on and we call them Malaysian. But then at the same time, we don't recognize that these hybrid dishes are actually they come from people who are originally migrants to the land. And if we accept these dishes, why do we not accept the people who make them, right? Why do we say go back where you came from? Like, how do you go back to some place that you didn't grow up in? Okay, so Peranakan identity. So Peranakan just means off this land, right? So an adopted child, I guess, of this place. Now that term can be used to describe the Chinese Peranakans, or it can be used to describe the Jawi Peranakans. So the Jawi Peranakans are again Indian migrant backgrounds, who both the Indian and the Chinese who've lived here for so long that they have adapted local customs or local cultures. So with the Chinese Peranakans, in my family, my both sides, both my maternal and my paternal sides, you would cook dishes that was a mix of Chinese. So some dishes would be purely Chinese, and some dishes would be a mix of Malay and Thai, because you have the Chinese Peranakans from Malacca and the Chinese Peranakans in Penang are slightly different. So the ones in Penang, they speak more Hokkien mix, and the ones in Malacca, they speak more Malay patois. But again, it's very mixed. So as Penang Hokkiens or Penang Peranakans, you go to Fujian and you don't understand what they're saying, because they don't understand what we're saying, because our language is already so mixed up with Malay words. So the Chinese Peranakans, the story goes that there was an entourage from China who settled in Malacca when this so-called Princess Hang Lipo came. Today, the princess's status has been contested. She could have been a concubine or a consort of one of these Chinese emperors, or not even an emperor, I don't know. But anyway, the men eventually intermarried local Malays. They could be Malays, but some people also believe that they might have been Sumatrans or whatnot, because they never converted to Islam, and they kept, like in Penang, we kept the Chinese ancestor worship, observed all the rituals and the festivities, Mooncake Festival, the Mid-Autumn Festival. Those kinds of festivals were all observed and customs were kept. But in terms of the cooking, we adopted and the coconut milk, lots of kind of dishes and styles of cooking that were local. And also in terms of language, that was adopted, and clothing. So the women would wear sarong at home, or the kebaya. But the nyonya kebaya, the nyonya is the word for woman, and baba is the word for men. So the male Peranakan is the baba, and the nyonya would be the female Peranakan. So the woman, the nyonya, would wear a short tight top, and I believe it's shorter than the Malay one, right? The blouse. So in terms of fashion, they were very particular and quite different from other Chinese or newer Chinese. But it's kind of a dying culture. Today, probably not so much. In the past, the Peranakans were considered, or they were also known as the Straits Chinese, of the Straits settlement during the colonial days, and they became, because they had lived here longer, they were the intermediaries between the Sinket, the new Chinese who had just arrived, and the British officials. So the Peranakans had quite a glorified position. They sent their children to, most of them sent their children to English education because that was the way to go. That was the way to gain status and climb up the social ladder and to get jobs in the civil service. So they worked quite closely with the British, but at the same time, they were probably in Penang, the heads of these triads. So they kind of straddled both worlds. They were a hybrid. They were mixed in that way. They could get ahead in the Chinese world, and they could also sit at a table with a British colonial whatever and be judges, etc. And sometimes you see that reflected in their households, in the way they set up the house and the architecture, the materials that were used to build the house. If you ever go to Phuket in Thailand, there's again one of these colonial Peranakan mansions that have been preserved, and you see how you have two living room sets or two dining room sets. You have the Peranakan one and you have the Western one. The European one had chandeliers and beautiful glass and kind of cooking ware and all the utensils all set up very straight back chairs, all of that perfect. Then the more local one again. So yeah, very hybrid and very privileged in that way. So when the British left, I think then there is much more intermarriage, and also between the Peranakan Chinese and then the other Chinese. And with the Islamization and Malay hegemony, then the Chinese and Peranakans and the Chinese who send their kids to Chinese schools, I think that distinction is, starting to break down now, because I guess just as the race lines are becoming stricter, so the Chinese Peranakans felt that they were now considered Chinese, and they had to kind of form they had to be more united with the Chinese, because they didn't get any special privileges. They weren't considered Bumiputra like the Malays. Or Bumiputra just means sons of the soil, and it's a special status that's given to recognize that you are indigenous in Malaysia. So they didn't get any special privileges. I think at some point they tried. They didn't get it, so they were just considered Chinese like the rest. So today, particularly now with the Chinese Malaysians who were in the past English educated, or who went to national schools, they are starting to send their children to Chinese language schools. So in that case, I think that is breaking down the difference between the Chinese educated and the national educated or national medium schools, which in the past, before 1971, were in English, and then gradually became Malay. The other problematic way of defining cosmopolitanism is that it just means that we live in a globalized world today, where we can wear in Malaysia we can wear and find Doc Martens boots, and wear a sari, with our Doc Martens boots. We can buy a Gap pair of jeans or something, and so that kind of and then you can say I'm cosmopolitan. I'm eating McDonald's and wearing this and doing this, and I'm pulling together different identities from different parts of the world together. I mean, that is not critical cosmopolitanism. That is just consuming. It's that you're a consuming citizen, but a consuming citizen isn't a thinking citizen, right? So in Malaysia, the critical cosmopolitan is someone who is thinking critically about race, about the things that divide us, and how to break down that barrier. So sure, we can eat together, and I think that it's already very difficult for people who don't eat together to come and eat together. And also, when you eat together, on whose terms are we eating together? So a lot of the times, ethnic minorities in Malaysia will compromise, because that is the way you adapt and you live, and you have a kind of give and take situation. But when there are policies that are put in place, and also when there's not just policies but people who push for that, then you feel, but why is it always the minorities who have to compromise? Why is it that the majority is taking certain things for granted, and perhaps abusing those privileges, and they've forgotten about how to live in difference? So in that last chapter, I use Yin Ang's theory of living together in difference. Right? So Yin Ang is a Chinese Indonesian female scholar who left to go and study in the Netherlands, and then eventually ended up in Australia. So she's talking about multiculturalism in Australia, what it's like to have this, you're not white Australian, you might face subtle forms of racism in Australia. How do you deal with it? So she says, living in a multicultural society is like a balance, right? You have to live together in difference. And that living in difference is that when you live in an ordinary way, in every day, it's a constant juggle of accepting people's difference. So there'll be some things that you like. Oh, I love to eat nasi lemak, but those neighbors, they are so loud and they're Malay. It's that idea of, well, if you like certain things, you have to take both the positive and the negative. So it's a constant negotiation, and it's kind of ambivalent in that way. So I use her term, and Jean and I turn it around. We talk about eating together in difference. So how do we eat together in difference, so that as we're sitting down together and eating this food, we also have to recognize the people's differences, on whose terms, what is the power relationship like. And one of the key points in the book too, I think, is a point that an anthropologist brings up, talking about the host-guest relationship. So in anthropology, food anthropology, we talk about food and the power relationship and the symbolic relationship between the person who gives the food and the person who accepts or takes the food. So as the host, you have a higher position, because you are the person who has all this capital, you have all this money or this food that you give out, and when you disperse the food, it's to show that you have the power in a way, right? You are able to be magnanimous, you're able to be generous, you're able to share this food with your guests. As the guest, you are on the receiving end, right? So you are not the patron. Now, if you lay this over the racial dynamics in Malaysia, so you have in Malaysia now, because of the Islamization, you have Malay Muslims who are happy to pay host, right? During Hari Raya, at the end of Ramadan, Malay Muslims will have an open house and invite all their Chinese, Indian, Eurasian friends to come and eat. But then in the past, you had the open house for Chinese New Year, where again the Chinese would return the favor by inviting their Malay, Indian, Eurasian friends to come. And because of Islamization, you have Malay Muslims being a little bit more reluctant to go to the open house. And if they go to the Chinese open house, they might not eat the food. They might only drink the packet drinks because they're afraid that the things are not halal, the kitchen is not halal, they cook pork, you have to wash the pork 7 times with this sand first before it's halal, right? So there's this sense now where the Chinese will only ever be the guests and they cannot host Malays. And it's very ironic because then that means that allows the very conservative ethno-nationalist Malay groups to say, you Chinese, you are always a guest on this land. You should know your place. But it's not like the Chinese don't want to play host. They want to play host. They want to return the favor, but they're unable to because of Malay hegemony that are kind of made into policies. Yeah.